Almost every woman today has faced some sort of social issue, whether it be domestic violence, child marriage, unequal pay, or lack of bodily autonomy. Welcome to Unstitched Voices. I'm your host Amna, and I, along with my guests, will take a deep dive into the plethora of social issues that women face on a regular basis. In today's episode, we're starting off with someone who's at the heart of this conversation. Durre Sameen works at an NGO that is centered around gender based violence prevention and runs an online platform dedicated to raising awareness about women's rights. Welcome, Durre Sameen.
Thank you, Amna, for having me on the podcast.
Can you tell us a bit about what you do and what inspired you to take such a career path?
So, like you already said, I work for an NGO that works on preventing gender based violence, and we work primarily on intimate partner violence projects. But increasingly, the focus is shifting towards preventative work. This is because it's important to address domestic and gender based violence once it takes place. But the long term solution as a society has to be investing in preventing this violence. I think in my case, what inspired me is I've been a feminist since before I knew the term existed. In some ways, I feel it's been in me forever. However, I didn't really think of it as a career path. That happened more as an accident, and I can explain that later.
Was there any particular story that inspired you?
Yes, one that I can think of is some years ago, I worked for an organization in Islamabad. At this point, I felt very lost personally in terms of my career, and I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go. This organization that I was working with, they had a project exploring women's decisions to self-abort in Pakistan. I'd never even heard of the term self-abort before, and if you haven't either, it means when a woman ends a pregnancy on her own without medical supervision, often because she lacks access to safe, legal, and affordable abortion services. I was someone who'd studied feminist theory in college. I lived abroad. I considered myself quite knowledgeable on women's issues. But this project opened my eyes to my own privilege and to the fact that I don't know anything about the lives of the vast majority of women in my own country, let alone the world. Around that time, I also realized that I wasn't just interested in being a feminist in my own life, but also working in the feminist sphere in a very concrete way.
What's interesting is that you mentioned women having a lack of bodily autonomy. What do you think are some other common issues that women encounter, and what roles do social expectations play into these problems?
There's no short and easy answer for this. In Pakistan, women, as you know, face a range of problems. These are social, economic, cultural challenges that are all deeply interconnected with traditional gender expectations. For me, what stands out as the most significant issue is the fact that women and girls have a very limited access to education, especially in rural Pakistan, where families often prioritize boys' schooling over girls. In many cases, even when girls do attend schools, there's early marriage and household responsibilities, which mean that they drop out at a very young age. And of course, there's so much research that connects girls' education to empowerment, to economic independence, and even better health outcomes. So for me, this feels like the root of many of the other issues and inequalities that women in Pakistan face. I think that when girls are denied an education, they're denied the chance to make informed choices about their lives, to participate in the workforce, and ultimately to challenge harmful traditions. Education also gives women confidence and awareness of their rights and the ability to contribute to their communities. So, without having access to education, the cycle of dependency and discrimination actually continues from one generation to the next. Uh, beyond beyond education, of course, women also face a range of other social issues. So a big one, in my opinion, is economic dependence, which means that many women either do unpaid domestic work or low-paid informal jobs, and social norms often prevent them from working outside of the house. But even when women do work outside of the house, they don't always have autonomy over the money that they earn. Then, of course, there's gender-based violence, domestic abuse, honor crimes, which I think are very particular to this part of the world. And all of these remain not just pervasive, but also often unexplored because there's so much stigma and taboo around talking about these issues. Something that's very specific to this part of the world is the idea of honor and how women's mobility is actually restricted because of this concept of parda and chardivari. And what that means is women actually have limited access to work opportunities, but also sometimes to healthcare because they wouldn't go to a male doctor or wouldn't even be allowed to travel to a hospital. And of course, they have a limited access to public life.
A lot of the social issues that you discuss don't seem very mainstream and may even be unheard of for some people. So, do you think that awareness regarding these social issues has increased in recent years? And what role does social media play here?
For me, the answer is yes and no. I definitely feel that awareness around women's rights has increased, even if I compare it, for example, to my own childhood. For instance, when I was 13, 14, I didn't even know the term feminism, and today it's hard to imagine a young person not being aware of this term. Social media definitely has allowed these terms and also movements such as the Aurat March to go beyond a limited bubble. For me, I think it's hard to imagine Aurat March, which is the Women's Day parade that takes place in multiple cities in Pakistan on the 8th of March, that it would have existed in this way without social media. But at the same time, there's also been a great backlash to this, and this has been not just in Pakistan, but globally. I know from my own experience that every time a video of mine goes viral, inevitably it attracts men that I would say are more conservative leaning. In the West now, at least, there's significant research to say that there's a widening gap among Gen Z boys and girls when it comes to views on gender. So in the West specifically, but I think this can also apply to Pakistan, young women and girls are more likely to hold progressive views than previous generations. However, young men and boys are more conservative than men in older generations. I don't know if this specific research exists in Pakistan, but I do have anecdotal evidence to say that it's true. For example, in my generation, all my friends, all my male cousins, none of them knew what the term feminist was. And to be very honest, I also didn't growing up. But we all had this general understanding that boys and girls are equal, they should have access to equal rights and opportunities. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's true anymore. I see young Pakistani men from progressive, privileged backgrounds sharing content that promotes misogyny, for example, Andrew Tate posts. Many of them are influenced by online communities that are very sexist and anti feminist, which we call the manosphere. And in Pakistan, this is a very, very big online community.
You spoke about conservativeness, and something that I've noticed through my own research is that women in Pakistan are not very likely to speak about the social issues that they go through. So, what are some common barriers that prevent women from asking for help?
One of the best tools that the patriarchy has is actually the idea of internalized misogyny. What happens is because as women from a very young age, we live in patriarchal societies, we're conditioned in a certain way to absorb and accept many of the society's sexist beliefs and stereotypes that we see around us. Consequently, what happens is when you're in a problem, you often blame yourself for the problems without recognizing that's the patriarchy that needs to be blamed. For example, a woman experiencing domestic violence often feels it's her duty to endure this abuse, or she has done something to receive this abuse, or if she complains about it, she's overreacting. I know as a teenager, many times when I was harassed on the streets, my first thought would be, this wouldn't have happened if I had behaved differently. And I know I'm not the only one in our society that feels this way because this internalized misogyny runs very, very deep. So even if a woman does do the work of unlearning these beliefs and overcoming internalized misogyny, she still has to face the social stigma and shame that surrounds being a woman fighting for her rights. Even if you as a woman individually don't care about the social stigma, there is the concept of izzat or bringing honor or dishonor upon your family if society finds out that you've been abused. And this is especially pervasive in our society. So in cases of domestic abuse, harassment, or even marital conflict, women are very often silenced because they don't want to bring shame or dishonor upon their families. Then, of course, there's a very big aspect of economic dependence. If you're financially reliant on a husband or father who's abusive, what are you going to do if you leave him because you need him to support you financially? And leaving this abusive situation means losing your food, losing your shelter, losing your stability. So many women stay within these abusive families just because there's nowhere to go if they wanted to leave. And then, even if you decide to break all these barriers and stand up for yourself, the big question is, who do you turn to, or where do you turn? Many women don't know about their legal rights that they have in Pakistan. We don't know what the available support services are and how we can access them. And I think finally, when you do say, okay, I want to assert my rights, I want to access a support service, even when women do ask for help, unfortunately, in our society, there's so much corruption. There's biases within the police and judicial systems, which really discourage women from pursuing justice. In the early 2000s, when I was growing up, there was a very high profile gang rape case. Many of our listeners might already remember this. In the early 2000s, Mukhtar Mai was a woman who was gang raped on the orders of a village council. And she broke through all the barriers of internalized misogyny to take her case to the court. In 2002, then the court convicted 6 of the men involved in this rape, but the other 8 were actually acquitted because there wasn't enough evidence, according to the court, which overturned 5 of these 6 convictions. Mukhtar Mai then went to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court rejected her appeal. And it upheld the decision that these 5 men would be acquitted. So a woman who was gang raped in front of other people actually went without justice in this very, very high profile case. And that just shows you the gaps in our system and the challenges that women face in accessing justice. Of course, this was in the early 2000s, and Pakistan has changed a lot in the last 16 years. But there's still very deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes. There's still weak enforcement of laws. And there is still so much social resistance that many women continue to face immense challenges when they speak up.
A similar case of this injustice is that of Nur Muqaddam's, whose murderer, despite having substantial evidence against him at the time, was only found guilty 4 years later, and still to this day has not paid the price for his crimes. What do you think our listeners and youth can do to make a difference?
If you're listening to a podcast on women's rights in Pakistan, I think you're already a part of the solution because you're curious and you want to learn. There's no one way that we can all make a difference, but I think it's important that everyone looks at their own life and thinks to themselves, what is the one thing I can do that will make this country and this world a better place for women and girls? You just mentioned the Nur Muqaddam case, and I do have to say that the fact that so many people took to social media, but also that so many people were outside the courts when the proceedings were happening, so many protests were organized, that did play into the case gaining the prominence that it did. A lot of the cases make it to newspapers, but they get buried under the headlines. But this was a case that really made headlines, and that is because so many of us individually decided to do something about it, to speak up. And I think that's the one thing we need to keep doing every time we see injustice. The answer for what you can do specifically is different for everyone, but one thing that we can all do is we stay curious, we stay open to learning and unlearning, and most importantly, we stay open to speaking out whenever we see injustice around us in our society, in whatever capacity we can.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights really help set the stage for the rest of our series. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.